Quiver, New Weapons for Thought, a post-Deleuzian political project that takes thinking to be an instrument of combat. Unapologetically queer, feminist, anti-capitalist, and abolitionist.
Thank you so much, everyone, today. This week, we're talking about broadly conceived the digital or technology and information. We've got two texts that we read. First, a section from Alexander Galloway and Eugene Thacker's Exploit, and then second, a section on racializing surveillance from Simone Browne. And I was thinking I would present on the exploit. I could also present on the Browne as well, but I was going to begin with the exploit. And I just have some introductory remarks. They're really more of a thumbnail sketch than anything else. But I wanted to talk about four things. First, just an elementary background on the texts. Then really first, to propose that they're giving us a new topology or a new metaphysical schema to understand. Second, a question of power or a new logic of conflict. And then third, I want to simply complicate it from the perspective of the intervening 14, 15 years since it was written. So very briefly on the background of the authors, both of them came from a theory-intensive background. Galloway's first book, as well as Thacker's first book, really set the paradigm to understand the contributions here. And maybe I'm going too far in describing their contributions to this book from those initial ones, but it's worth just sort of noting because I think it sets a helpful framework for understanding. Galloway's first book, Protocol, How Decentralization Survives After Networks, is very much a combination of a number of influences. Digital studies, having helped work with the arts program website approach Rhizome, as well as a Jamesonian sort of concern for a Marxist periodization of, for him, really the present, but it also imagines itself in relationship to a historical past. Then also sort of French and Italian post-structuralist and political Marxist, post-Marxist considerations of power. And his basic argument is that in the age of networks and computers, things have not simply gotten more liberatory or free. It's that the older modes of disciplinary power have been replaced by a mode of control, which we know from Deleuze's famous 1990 essay on control societies. And he really gives it depth and theorization of someone who knows computers, computer science, information theory, and connecting it to a variety of fields, including art. And then Thacker's first book, who taught at a very famous school, who puts together both humanistic inquiry with scientific technology, Georgia State, before going to the new school where he is now, was on bioart, and a very thoughtful consideration of bioart from an information theory perspective, understanding truly what the connection of biology and technology might be from both a scientific perspective, but then how it's brought into art, aesthetics, and ultimately still, as we see in this book, questions of power and politics. Additionally, in this book, in the short précis or preceding remarks called On Reading This Book, they say they have a number of condensed italicized headings that they say are, quote, glued together with more standard prose. And they say that if one wants to gloss or read the book very quickly, you could simply read the italicized portions. And that might be an interesting sort of experiment to exclude all of the prose and simply have the italics and publish it maybe as a handout or as a zine. And it's an interesting formal writing challenge or experiment to us as well to also incorporate mixed modes of writing that would then be interesting from the perspective of reading. Can we write a series of headings that make up a book unto itself or a text unto itself that is then further outlined through other forms of writing? No doubt it's a little bit like the nomadology plateau, which through the series of axioms and propositions, one could read that on its own. And I think that it plays into the character of the book a bit as well, in that while they're complicating things through a sort of materialism, that each one of their italicized writings are almost an axiom or a proposition. And we might ask this larger question about D&G, if that's still, one of our topics of concern here, which is, why was the nomadology plateau written as a series of axioms and propositions, especially when D&G argue that axiomatic thinking is state thinking? And what precisely is going on in having a series of axioms and propositions, but then perhaps the prose is undoing it somehow? And do we see that same sort of operation in this text? Perhaps, but I think one could make it even more dramatic as well, in which there's a series of conflicts or exploits written into the very structure of writing itself. So if one wanted to, let's say, rewrite this book, you could write it by having a series of protocological or life writing axioms that you then undermine through the prose meant to explain it, perhaps. I don't know, it's just one line. So it's the book itself, it has a structure, but we'll not really discuss it. People can find it out and look more at that for themselves. I want to move on to the topology, or new metaphysical schema. Perhaps this is still too crude, but it's a combination of protocol and the bio and the biological. So a few ideas here. What are the objects being discussed? Or I should say, what is a topology? So a topology, popularly used first in mathematics as a form of geometric thinking, but then exported into all of the realms of thought in which we use mathematical thinking, and the diagrams or models it proposed are in this very Gaucherian way, taking models or ideas, what he called metadisciplinary meta-modeling, or transdisciplinary meta-modeling, taking a model from one field, figuring out how to transport it into another, without making it simply a direct exportation, how to give it a new life, but maintaining its rigor. Okay, so what is a topology? A topology in geometric thinking is about using the geometric approach, where you define things initially through shapes, and that is in fact a shape-based approach, and those shapes are defined as a series of points in which the shape itself can modulate or move without changing the definition of the shape. So a triangle has 3 points, but they're also thinking in 3 dimensions. And this gave way to popular thinking, like through Lacan or others who are interested in Kleinian bottles or Borromean knots. The way in which it's interesting to D&G, for instance, is Deleuze writes sometimes about origami, which once again is a series of lines and points, but he's interested then in also the operation of the folding and the unfolding. So it's not simply defining it by the points, which perhaps still be a little more axiomatic, still be very definitional, and Deleuze famously doesn't like thought experiments or definitional thinking. And so while the operations themselves might have a sort of definitional thinking involved in them with the topology and the shape making, is interested in the movement that occurs in and through those shapes. So the topology here, we might define it, according to these points or according to these shapes. So there are objects, and the 2 primary objects that they're using as a form of thought are computers and organisms. And there are various ways to define a computer, but I would say that they're using fairly standard ones. A computer as something that would pass a Turing test, or a computer that's defined by von Neumann architecture, which is to say that it engages in, for Kittler, he would say that it has recording, processing, and inscription. Remember the third one is? Yeah. It's the control mechanism that encodes and decodes and sends information across the various parts. And then an organism, and the organism, remember from this very Foucauldian order of things, history of science point of view, an organism can be various things in various epistemes. And so they're using a post-genetic approach to an organism. So an organism as the living out of some sort of genetic code. It's a concretization within a world, probably having gone through a form of evolution in that it is a whole object made up of a series of parts. It's a molar entity, and that it not only fills a niche, but it also goes through competition symbiosis with other organisms. And so there's a wider ecology to how it functions. Okay, so these are our two types of objects that we're considering here. And they don't want to use them as metaphors, but they're perhaps analogies, or even just the types of objects that populate the landscape that they're thinking of. And they want to think of the rest of the world in relationship to them. Then there are also subjects. And here the subjects, it's a little less clear, but I think that the viral is what helps define both of them. We have a computer virus as a subject, and we also have a biological virus as a subject. And they're interested in the coincidence between these two things, and I think that they are very similar. We'll probably have to dig into this a little bit more in the conversation, but they're interested in how a bioengineered organism, perhaps one even weaponized in something like bioterrorism, can be very similar to a non-engineered but natural virus, such as SARS, as well as a computer virus, which is to say something that is completely manufactured from start to finish. All elements of it are manufactured. And they want to, importantly, distinguish between these three, but then also to say there are similarities. And that through comparing the three of them, you might reveal things that we wouldn't otherwise expect. Wouldn't just sort of take at their face. Okay, subjects. These are the active agents doing things. Also in terms of systems, they want to think in terms of computer science. Say, hey, computer science has a perspective. What if this sort of computer science perspective actually has influenced not only the ways in which we make computers, but also other aspects of the world? So this would be, for instance, considering information in informatization, which famously information gets mathematized by Shannon and Weaver. So there becomes a way to not only think of it in the precision of mathematics or in the models of mathematics, but it also becomes diagrammable. And you start coinciding a number of different fields like engineering. You can have electrical engineering that makes circuits that then combine with, let's say, the symbolic thinking of something like philosophy. And then you get fields of semantic reason, which then are what computer programmers do. And for them, there's a level of precision that builds into a systematicity in which things can be basically thought out on a piece of paper and then worked out in a rigorous fashion. And one could say you either can or cannot do it. And they, in the book, consider this in terms of things like international politics, which shouldn't be too novel of a proposition if you follow things like what happens in and through World War II and after it, where operations research, cybernetics, other computationally informed forms of thinking suddenly become quite important. And so like the Cold War, mutually assured destruction, game theory, all of these things exist within a similar sort of framework of thought. Okay, so we have computer science as one system. The other system is epidemiology. And so epidemiology itself is not just about, let's say, molecular biology or biology of organisms or genetic evolution or something. is it in relationship to populations. So a population where there might be individual subjects or objects that make up the whole, but the whole is considered from the perspective of a population. And so this is a very biopolitical paradigm in which the population is the object of thought, and the system coheres on the level of a population. And they say that this is really a form of thinking that is present, but also it defines a form of thinking that is important outside of epidemiology itself. And in fact, they'll say that epidemiology and computer science have an odd sort of coincidence in the ways in which we can think about international politics, terrorism, all of these various sort of ideas that are floating around here. And then what is the abstract logic of both of them? I'm very sure that the abstract logic of the computational side is binary. And binary itself is kind of funny. Like there's this Kitlerian argument that, when you actually look at a computer, its most basic crude materialist element is actually a silicon plate with things like copper and other wire carrying charges. They're more there are conductors, there are capacitors, there are, objects that also go on this board as well. But really, it is electricity going across the plate. And there are things like gates for them that help translate or limit so that the variation of this analog current is then made into a digital 0 or a 1. But if you were to actually measure it, it's never precisely just 0 and 1. It's variation. It will go above and beyond. And so there's this sort of translation process. So binary itself is already built on top of, it's a layer on top of a physical infrastructure. And if you were to talk to a computer scientist, they actually think in terms of virtualization or of abstraction. So let's say like a computational machine has like 7 layers of abstraction. There'll be a network layer. There will be, a processing layer. There'll be the assembly layer. And so these various layers themselves have a system of coherence to them, and it depends on which layer you're looking at to understand how that coherence operates. So it's kind of interesting, right? And it's kind of what we're looking at. So it's a little bit, it's a bit arbitrary to say that we're thinking just in the level of the virtualization of binary, because it's not necessarily binary as like the final instance of its own logical operations, but it's something that seems so fundamental to understanding how the other layers bootstrap on top of it. That binary seems an interesting sort of intervention. And on the other side, for the biological, I'm not as sure. It could be genetics. It could be the population. It could be something else. Maybe it's genetics. And genetics is interesting here in that, once again, it is a code. In the same way in which binary is a code, it's an encoded way of looking at analog electrical currents. So too is genetics is a coded way of looking at the, combinations of amino acids that make up a sort of directing element of an organism. There are people who know this material much better than I would to be able to actually give it more firm footing. But the idea is that genetic code doesn't necessarily direct or determine in this sort of totalizing way what an organism will be, because obviously there's variation. Certain aspects of genetics get unlocked due to environment at various times and to various consequences. But once again, there's this sort of encoded partial direction that seems to be an abstract logic that is important to think here. Okay, so this is a topology. One could keep working through this. This is the sort of thing that one does in philosophy or post-philosophy, in which you sort of come up with the metaphysics to see the world, and perhaps it's too metaphysical at a certain point. And I know the Heideggerians are probably yelling at us about having not destructed our metaphysics, and the Derridians are here saying, the system itself doesn't really come together, and we need to push on one element or another. But what's interesting is that these are systems that not only carry intense belief, but we've sort of built whole worlds around them. And I think that's sort of the point that they're saying here. It's not that they're necessarily true or right, but that they sort of define, they're the basic components to a world that's worth exploring and considering, and ultimately from a, let's say, a post-Marxist materialist point of view, critiquing, submitting to critique, but not to say it's illegitimate, but to understand what its capacities are, to find its limitations, and ultimately probably to move beyond. Okay, so that's the topology. So then let's ask this question of power. What's the new logic of conflict that we get? And so on the one hand, we have what's said to be a protocological present. So protocol and logic, protological present. The other one, a biopolitical present. So in terms of protocol, we didn't read this section of the book. So let me very quickly just sort of bring your attention to a few of the remarks given about protocol very early on in the book, page 28 for your reference. You know, they talk about how protocol is a series of technoscientific rules and standards that govern relationships within networks. I should say that the overwhelming theory for the whole metaphysical schema is networks. We now live in an era of networks. And it's not that networks set us free in a way in which the sovereign triangle was not free. It's that it's a completely different sense. So the protocol are the technoscientific rules and standards that govern it. And they say in the next sort of italicized portion on page 29, protocol is twofold. It's both an apparatus that facilitates networks and a logic that governs how things are done within that. And here are the bullet points that they sort of put beneath it. So we have a clear sense of what protocol is and how it functions. Protocols emerge through complex relationships between autonomous interconnected agents. 1. 2, to function smoothly, protocological networks must be robust and flexible, which is to say that they must accommodate a high degree of contingency through interoperable and heterogeneous material interfaces. 3, protocological networks are inclusive rather than exclusive. Discrimination, regulation, segregation of agents does happen on the inside of protocological systems, but not by the selective extension or rejection of network membership to those agents. Which say they're not excluded a priori, they're included, but they might just be like segregated. They might, you know, there might be a box other, or they might be put in a different place, but they're sort of in there and they operate. So things would be regulated or controlled by inclusion rather than exclusion. Okay, 4. Protocols are universal and total, but diachronic emergence of protocols is always achieved through political liberalism, such as negotiation, public vetting, and openness. So it tries to encompass everything, all possible use cases, let's say. And if things are excluded, or its management is thought through a form of liberalism where it's like everything will be included. It's just it needs to be vetted first, or it needs some sort of light regulatory framework. Okay. And then lastly, protocol is an emergent property of organization and control in networks, and thus radically horizontal and distributed. And so very briefly before we move on, I'll say that what's sort of remarkable about protocol in this instance is that these are things that a lot of people posit as the ultimate good, especially from a sort of political liberal standpoint. So when imagine a protocol is the best possible system in the world, you know, Rawlsians might be like, this is it. We already live in utopia. We just need to keep working with what we have. Neoliberals, happy with the Washington Consensus, might say the internet is the culmination of human progress, you know, and famously, you know, Eric Schmidt, along with the policy analyst, Jared Cohen, wrote a book called The New Digital Age, after meeting in Iraq, of all places, in order to rebuild the place, rebuild after destroying it, in which they say, the internet, of course, it's going to birth some problems, but it is the new prevailing political paradigm for the world, and a great one, and a positive one. It allows everyone to participate, allows people to dissent, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there are like all kinds of justifications, frameworks for it. Okay. Certainly we wouldn't want to follow that. Okay. The other side, the biopolitics. There's a lot that goes under the question of biopolitics. Foucault proposed it initially in History of Sexuality, Volume 1. And there, I think the easiest way to get to it, regardless of all the directions people have done, is that pithy transformation, he says, from sovereign power. A sovereign power in which there's a despotic monarch who controls things is able to let live and make die. If the despot likes you, they will let you live, which is to say they will ignore you, the feudal peasant. You get to live the life as you want to. But if the monarch does not like you, they will kill you. And this is the famous sort of introduction of the killing of Damien the Regicide in Discipline and Punish, a sort of spectacular form of torture in order to build up the symbolic power of the sovereign, to show that any transgression against the sovereign is met with overwhelming force that is largely a symbolic resource that they manage and control, often through just this excess of their symbolic ability to manage their own persona and power. What Foucault argues is the shift towards biopolitics is an inversion in which power now makes you live, you have to live, and this is the sort of mandatory self-maintenance citizens and participants have to go through. I'd imagine a lot of people would be fired from their work if they showed up looking any such way or not living their life according to whatever norms, customs, and principles of their employer might be. And then if it dislikes you, but this is also where the state invests in the health of its own population too, because it sees it as a benefit in order to manage its health. But only the forms of health that it wants, of course. This is, for instance, let's say China's one-child policy. It says, yes, you can only have one child, but when you have that one child, we'll help take care of it, and they become a citizen and member of the state, and all kinds of privileges, benefits that come from it. And the other side is it lets you die, which is to say its form of treating disliked subjects is not necessarily to outright mark them for death and to aggressively pursue them, though certainly this still happens. There's a necropolitical way in which Black Death is created through policing. But there's also a new paradigm in which it just sort of ceases to provide healthful living care that is otherwise expected and usual for everyone else. And so it just, let's say, creates a system where you have to be employed through a wage providing employer to live, and then there will be unemployment, and that certain people will not be covered under unemployment. How would those people live? It says it's not the system's concern, and those people will just sort of die. And maybe they'll make do through gray market or black market activity, which sometimes it turns a blind eye to, and sometimes it regulates to try and prevent. And so, like in the communization theory, this is also a theory of surplus populations. Mike Davis would talk about it in City of Slums. There's this whole question of what is it of a system that intentionally creates an outside for itself, where it doesn't necessarily violently enforce that outside. It just allows people to live on the outside that it takes no claim or right for, but then also understands implicitly that those people have no means of subsistence and die. And it's just because those people aren't performing good citizenship or other things. Okay, sorry, that's a long, elaborate explanation for biopolitics. But what's interesting is Thacker, and now Galloway and Thacker, then take the other aspect of life that's going on here too, which is vitalist philosophies, popular with Henri Bergson, who of course is quite influential for D&G, but also the other forms of life philosophy that are quite popular in the 20th century. And they say, how's this sort of sustained? And Donna Haraway, for instance, would say that life philosophy in the 20th century actually becomes cybernetic. It's less about these sort of previous ontologies or metaphysics where an organism would be good or bad, or you think of it in a sort of sense of wholeness. And we think of it now in evolution. It's shifting, it's changing, it's mutating. It never was one thing, it never will be one thing. It's always in a process of becoming a constant transformation. And Thacker importantly says, this is neither good nor bad. It's just a statement for how people look at, the metaphysical schema for how people look at the world right now. And in fact, it's dangerous in the Foucauldian sense, that it can be used for a variety of political purposes. So that's the basic questions of power, but then they propose something quite interesting here. And I think this is what's so important for us. They say, let's take the perspective of informatization, or the way in which things are turned into information. And just, very briefly, what does it mean for something to be turned into information? There are all kinds of qualitative forms of communication. To be made into information means that it's made quantitative, calculable. It can be put in a system, which is precisely what's happening on, these airwaves right now. And at least for Shannon and Weaver, the thing that becomes calculable or quantifiable, at least initially, is not the content. So the words that we use is not what's quantifiable. It's the medium. It's the transmission system that becomes quantifiable. And in fact, there's often a complete split between the two, in which it is obscure from the content itself is obscure from the perspective of form. So do the engineers at Zoom know what we're talking about right now? Perhaps not. Probably not. There's no great surveillance network that Zoom is doing in which they're having all of the content of our conversations beamed to them all at once. It's not to say that you can't attempt to quantify the content as well as the form. There are many attempts to do this right now. That's what natural language processing has been and continues to be. There are other ways in which that have made it quite easy. So when you move from the just natural voice or speech that we have right now, the easiest way that we've encoded this and have for a long time is through written language, through letters, and then words. And in fact, machines are very good now at processing written speech. They're getting good enough, in fact, that you could probably pass a Turing test with some written speech, where you can have some, what they call AI, churn through libraries and statistically put together things that often appear next to each other. And you could have a conversation with a bot that feels like you're having a conversation with a person. We're not yet really at a place where one could go that through natural language to natural language. It still is mediated through the encoding of words and language. So that's interesting. What does that mean? It means that there is an attention to form and medium, like how things are transmitted, the form of how they're transmitted, that I think we still have a hard grasp on, because we always come back to this question of sort of content. We think the content is really what's important. But there have been important media theorists for the last 50 to 100 years as well, that I think have tried to get us to focus more on medium. Very famously, Marshall McLuhan, Hitler, or others. I would say Virilio might be a sort of figure in which they say it doesn't matter so much what you say, but how you say it. And that the how is precisely what's most important here. And that how you're saying it can often determine its consequences more than any particular content. And so that's one thing that we're asking today with the exploit. What is the how of a viroid form of communication, or a viroid form of information? The other things about information we could talk about too, but it's a fairly high level concept. I'll propose to people to look to Tiziana Terranova's network culture if you want one working through of it that I find really interesting. It's a little older now, but I think it's really sort of remarkable on this. Okay, so how did they cash this out? Well, their first sort of proposal on this is that we shouldn't look to power shifts anymore. They say that analog forms of power struggle or non-protocological forms of power struggle are usually about power shifts. So a non-protocological form of feminism would shift power from men to women. They say within protocological networks, it's not about shifting, but actually differentials. So understanding where there is a difference between two things, not resolving that difference, through the power shifting, but in fact, understanding where within those differences, there are holes that can be made into exploits. So this is just like a hacker approach to seeing the world. Hackers don't judge things morally as good or bad in some sort of general sense, and then stand on the side of good, through some sort of passive resistance or something like that. They look at a technical system and they try and understand what its vulnerabilities are, and then do a strategic assessment of who will be using these vulnerabilities, how will they be using these vulnerabilities, who are these vulnerabilities useful to, and in what ways, and how do I maintain my ability to exploit these vulnerabilities while limit the people who I don't want to have access to these vulnerabilities. And some of it is just about a division of roles. Classically within security, digital security, there are people who work defense, which is to say find all available vulnerabilities and prevent them, to shore them up. And there are people who work offense. Sometimes they call themselves, red team, and they do any variety of roles like penetration testing. A pen tester will look at a system or approach an encountering system and try and identify and reveal vulnerabilities. They can even be hired by the firm itself or work for the firm in order to help them find their vulnerabilities. Or they can be working aggressively as some sort of group in order to exploit other people's vulnerabilities and turn things to their advantage. So the idea here is think like a hacker. And there are a lot of resources for this. I really like Mackenzie Wark's Hacker Manifesto. I think it's a great sort of approach to this, but there are many, many books that have been written on the subject. Okay. So that's both the power differential and the exploit. And so then the other one that I think is actually the prevailing sort of discussion here is the infection. And so they say that once there's a vulnerability that can be made into an exploit, the next step is to actually use the exploit through the logic of infection. And infection is not just to, open up the unlocked door that one didn't find open. It's a more complicated process. Once you get in, especially in a world of networks where there are protocols that both have abstract binaristic rules, but then they're network computers that you can then string things together. So not just one computer, but many other computers. And the logic of infection is to get the system to work against itself and then direct it towards other systems as well. And okay, we all kind of know what viruses are, we don't have to get in the weeds too much here. I think the interesting thing to consider is actually what happens sort of in the middle of the section that we had as an excerpt, which is, what does it really mean to say we live in an era where there is infection, things are infectable, and there's a logic of infection that overrides things? And they look at it at various protocological and let's say pseudo-biological layers. They say things like, and we know this having lived through a pandemic, planes and trains and transportation are protocological networks. They have a system of rules. They're prone to infection. And the way in which not only SARS, but now coronavirus has spread has by having planes that are networked. So our global transportation network is precisely what allows us to transport and communicate, which has many benefits, but it means that we also, our network existence makes us vulnerable to the forms of infection that follow it. It also means that the ways in which we map and think about responding to something like coronavirus itself is protocological. The way in which we see networked computer systems is precisely the same way in which epidemiologists saw us, the virus, its capacity to circulate, and prefigured the solutions that they suggested in order to respond to it. And so they ultimately give us the sort of chart on the final page that I gave us, in which they said, in our current society of control, our control diagram, which is to say, if we were to chart and model things out, we would currently have cybernetics and protocol. Our machines are those of computers. A resistive act are about mutation and subversion. Right? And think of mutation here as like logic of infection, which is to take something and transform it beyond belief. This is precisely what goes on with mainstream politics all the time too, right? There's a big, panic right now in the United States as the Republican Party has mutated, right? And it has been very effective for them to do that. And so one might ask, what are other ways in which, let's say, the left or other political entities we might care about might want to mutate politically? Or we might ask, 15 years after this book is over, is mutation even the most important paradigm right now? A delinquent act within a society control would be randomness, which is say the precise thing that computers cannot generate, cannot predict. A political algorithm would be one of disturbance. That would be like denial of service attacks, network outages, your subway stops running. Strategies would include security, but also the exception. Historical actors are communities and the people, and our mode of liberation, at least the one that's proposed, is neoliberal capitalism. Obviously, they don't like this, but it's sort of what we're told as our mode of liberation today. Then they say the future, which is this more sort of biological paradigm, its control diagram would be physics or particle swarms, its machine bioinformatics, resistive act desertion or perturbation, to perturb. Delinquent act would be non-existence. Just not to say no existence, doesn't cease to exist, but its existence is opaque or hidden or concealed or cryptographically encoded. Political algorithm would be hypertrophy. Stratagem of gaming or inception. I don't remember if the movie Inception had come out yet. Historical actor, the Hélène Vital, which is the vital life, or the multitude, and its mode of liberation, a life in common, sort of gesture towards communism here. Okay, I've probably gone way too far. I know that you all have incredibly interesting insights to give here, especially all the discussion of SARS. So I'll hand it over to everyone, but my last idea would be sort of, I like these ideas. I think they were really novel and innovative when they were written. And I also wonder, how might we update this, or how might have things changed? That's just my one sort of provocation. So.
I forgot my reaction. And I saw it to others. Thank you, Andrew. This was brilliant. Thank you. It was great. Anybody wants to talk, or maybe I should share some thoughts?
I think there's a hand up. Brendan, is that a hand or?
Okay.
Yeah,
Oh, great.
That was excellent. Thank you, Andrew. And I feel like I picked a great week to read Dark Deleuze, because I feel like all of this stuff kind of comes back to your idea of deconnection or deconnectivity that you describe in that book. This is great to me, just because I think one of the things that I think about most often right now is kind of disinformation. And I feel like this gave me like a good way to look at just the idea of social networks, and how did social networks first kind of install themselves maybe 15 years ago, which I guess would have been around the time this book came out. So I think that a lot of the people who were maybe working on those I think Thacker was kind of an inspiration to a lot of them already. I know that he had sort of this like small cult of following that I had heard described, like I think through NPR at some point. So I could see all of this being like very much how a lot of that stuff sort of came into being. And I feel like, how have things changed is just that we're kind of seeing I guess the political ambivalence coming to the fore at this point in terms of what is, what has happened. I think that's really all that I have. That's my intervention for now, but I'm going to step into the back and see what other people have to say.
Shall I step in? Yeah. Okay. That was really, really nice, nicely presented. So thank you, Andrew. My thought, this is very, very big thought, is just about comparing the time this was published and obviously the focus on SARS, and then now obviously we have a similar situation but bigger. The thing I noticed when I was reading just this passage is how SARS spread and was kind of allowed to spread in a way that COVID wasn't, at least in theory. Obviously COVID did spread, and partly the fact that it was so much more transmissible, that it was transmitting more, obviously had an effect on why it was shut down so much. But I was thinking, can we kind of try to understand possible changes in formulations of network by how these extreme limit cases kind of manifested themselves? Did they moderate it? Did they shut it down entirely? We'll have between different countries, we'll also have different ways of viewing this. And also, can we think of how these disruptions, so if we're thinking purely in terms of biological viruses, we've got bird flu, then SARS, then MERS, then swine flu, how none of those came to be anything like what COVID is. But when we're talking about COVID, we're also talking about those as well, because the network has sort of been adjusting itself based on these things continuing through history. And so how does any individual disruption kind of recursively turn back on itself in the future, if that makes any sense at all? And how does the network kind of absorb these disruptions and sort of work through them in some kind of temporal sense? I have no answers. I just thought that was something that came up. Thank you. Also, yes, hello, Kiyoshi's cat.
Maybe something to introduce just to keep this sort of historical piece going. I think you're absolutely right, Brendan, that social media doesn't really splash in the same way. Like, okay, this is published in 2007. Let's say it takes a year to go to print. Means it was probably written in 2005, 2006. So that's right as Facebook is launching. So it's this is pre-Facebook, if you will, before we knew any of how that happened. And it's pre-Web 2.0. One of the early essays to sort of presage what would happen in 2.0 is Tiziana Terranova's essay, Free Labor, in which she sort of imagines that free labor on the internet, which had already been happening, people who decide, I'm going to moderate this web forum, or other people who sort of provide their services because they see a sort of social value in doing it. That becomes the business model, let's say around 2008. And that's the era that we live in now. Certainly there are techies and engineers who are setting up platforms, but the real value that's produced in all of them is extracted from people for free through your participation. And so that's maybe one thing that's not addressed as fully here, that I'd imagine if they were to have rewritten this after Web 2.0, that would have been thought. But they're also thinking, let's say, a much bigger layer of this too, which is, what are the mutations in relation and in culture, politics, all these other things that rapidly happen once there is this form of participation, when people's grandmas are suddenly on the internet interacting with the people who already had the technical know-how to write their own web page in 1998. Another thing is that there was an era of hacking that was kind of interesting, which was early anonymous, as it goes through, let's say, the Occupy period, in which there's a series of pretty well done technical hacks of security forces going through the lulsec and anti-sec sort of period. But that more or less sort of ceased around 2015, 2016, and those people have taken a hard turn toward the right. And one of the other issues that arises then is that cryptocurrency, which is neither that crypto nor a currency, but it's a financial instrument basically, rather than a currency, allows hackers to much more easily engage in ransom schemes. And so in fact, the majority of hacks that probably happen right now are either major nation states trying to disrupt each other's infrastructure, like the famous Stuxnet virus that disrupted Iranian nuclear plants, nuclear refinement, I think. Or people doing ransomware against large corporations or even individual computers just on a mass scale. And so even distributed denial of service attacks, DDoS attacks, which were used during the anti-sec period against, let's say, MasterCard and Visa for refusing to take WikiLeaks payment information, is mostly just used by hackers now. There's still small levels of DDoS or isolated instances of DDoS network traffic disruptions that happen for hacktivist political reasons. But hacktivism is certainly not as prevalent or interesting. So it means that the politics of it has been recuperated by large actors, once again, huge states, people not like us. And it's less the rabble and the crowds. And very skilled and refined people are perhaps still using it, but often just for blatant personal gain or for really crude reasons that we probably don't have too much affiliation with. But that said, there were two major attacks last week, or within the last couple of weeks. One of them against the East Coast oil refinement system, or the oil transport system in the United States, which means that oil itself as a global commodity was being disrupted, which obviously interacts with questions like climate change. And another one was one of the big four cattle manufacturers, like slaughterhouses and that sort of thing. They were also victims of what was probably a ransomware attack. And so a major amount of cattle operations were disrupted in the US as well. So even if it's done by just like malicious criminal groups who, all they're in it is for the money rather than for any sort of political dimensions, they still sort of, JBS, thank you, JBS cattle. It reverberates through the system as well. So anyway, that's just a really quick sort of thumbnail on the more, let's say, topical current event side of it.
Perfect. Well, thank you, everyone, and thank you, Andrew, for the presentation. It was amazing. What I had in mind in terms of strategy or means, and again, focusing on this question of mutation and randomness, if this is still relevant. What I found really interesting was a discussion of the 5th generation viruses, the polymorphic viruses, which in order to avoid detection, they have it coded in themselves, a kind of randomness and mutation engine. And they're constantly changing their own existence, their own code, in order to avoid detection by antivirus systems. And I was wondering if we could see this, for an analogy, if we could see this as a paradigm for political organization, to exist in such a state of change and mutation and becoming that people cannot pin you down as a movement, cannot even pin you down as an identity. It's this kind of movement or this type of organization. And I recall here in this volume, I think it's Deleuze and Political Activism. There's an essay by Evans from the Zapatistas, and what he says is exactly this: that they took nomadism, both in the literal sense, moving around beyond Chiapas and establishing new regions, but also in a more kind of identitarian sense of being in flux and becoming, and rejecting the static identities of movements. So after a couple of years, they explicitly rejected the fact that they are, an indigenous movement. They want to link up with other types of struggle, and they say we're no longer an indigenous movement. So I think this is very interesting. We can think about the analogy with the polymorphic virus, which constantly changes the signature and yet can maintain a continuity of operations. And I think this really takes us back to the question of consistency, which is at the heart of 1,000 Plateaus, and also, very much discussed by people like Eugene Holland. The idea to maintain becoming and flux and change and mutation, but at the same time to have a consistency which allows you to survive and to carry through action and operation. So these were my thoughts. Thank you. Oh, thank you. Well, thank you very much, Andrew. I think brilliant, to say the least. And thank you, Harris, for, I think, starting me off on my thought. Is right now I'm engaged. So part of this conference is engaging on the future of architecture and why artificial intelligence is so relevant. So we're working with, so one of the top researchers is a neuroscientist. And a lot of the discussions is about creativity. What is creativity? What is a model of creativity? And they're having these discussions of, not about the virus, but looking beyond the human. So I'm not sure if it's post-human. I don't really understand the philosophical implications, but how do computers think? And what I'm understanding is that type of technology is maybe the idea of this group or societal thinking and the approach of understanding the infrastructure, the systems within it, how the system makes its moves, they're looking at applying it to the next gen computational systems like quantum computing. So quantum computing happened around 15 years ago at kind of its initial states. And now our university is offering introductory courses on computational quantum programming. So I think my question would be linking up alternative modes of thinking through artificial intelligence and how machines think, but maybe moving beyond the human and looking at the quantum as a way to revealing weaknesses within our own current system. So that's happening already. So they have high schoolers that are, or junior high students that are 14 years old that win $1 million prizes. So then they do research within the university to look at creating these systems that are impenetrable. So they basically go into hacking systems. They would hack into a bank to see if it works. So that would be, I think what you were saying, the aggressive or the red team. They're going offense. But then they go back and re-engineer it so that those steps can't be done. So they actually create different layers. So if the book was written before Facebook and before Web 2.0, current technology is a multiverse, or they call it this multi-existence paradigms, where ourselves are embedded within the system. So we are these multiple systems and networks at once. So, and I thought that was fascinating here. We have to think as systems or movements. So now our identities are basically mapped spatially as well as informationally all at once. And we as humans, is what I understand, is that we need to now create additional senses of awareness to live in these systems so that we can get the maximum benefit. And what corporations are doing is making these tools so that we can have opportunities. So the corporations already have an advantage, but they're making those tools so that everyone in the system has an advantage or can live in that paradigm. So that would be my comment, but I think I would thank Harris, because I thought about the 5th generation, and I don't understand the idea of viruses, but I have had dengue fever. So I can understand kind of the metaphor, like a lot of what I did was like, hey, I'm in America. I was born here in America. I'm going to go to close to the Amazon in shorts and t-shirts. Oh, wow, I'm never going to get sick. And boom, you know, I was dipped into a bathtub full of ice. I was rushed to a hospital. My heart didn't work for a year. I was bedridden for, you know, on and off for 6 months. So, you know, thinking about it in that way, and these researchers are now thinking 50 years in the future, how do we now look at maybe combining this idea of the quantum, looking at intelligences beyond the human, and then this multiverse? So it seems like there's this three-pronged attack to evolve, I think, first world countries that can benefit. So, but what about making that accessible to people? And is education, and I think for me, is education even a solution, or is it more of the problem? And I think Andrew, I think, made a comment last week or 2 weeks ago. I might be more of the problem unless I look at the holes and maybe embed some sort of virus or something in there that could live. So thank you.
Thanks, Gustavo. And really, really briefly, I think this book also raises the question, like, is more networks the answer to some of our problems, right? Because sometimes more networks just simply complicate or make things more difficult. I'll note that Tom Nomad's writing is important here because he thinks, I think, very much, very clearly from the sort of like security strategic perspective. And so he would be a great resource to sort of think through some of these things. And then also, just like a really quick throwaway here, some of the most insecure devices these days that can easily be broken into like botnets or other things are not so much like quantum computers, which probably get locked down pretty quickly or pretty easily, or people are really thinking about those. But actually what we might consider the inverse of it, which is all of these small, tiny network connected Internet of Things devices that are just multiplying. You probably heard this story about a girl who was so insistent that she wanted to keep tweeting, and her parents took her phone away from her. And then she moved to, like, I don't know, her TV, and she was able to find a way to tweet from her TV, and the parents took that away till finally she was still tweeting, but she was tweeting from her family's smart fridge. This is precisely sort of how a hacker thinks. They're like, okay, I could hack into, you know, the military or a large corporation. They have a lot of security. If I want to construct a botnet, what if I just go through people's routers that still have the original administration password that you can just sort of Google default password for, you know, such and such router, and then it'll tell you. You know, you can go through Xboxes and PlayStations. You can go through people's smart thermostats, and you can just sort of collect a whole horde of them. And so the general principle here is the weakest link, yeah, admin password. The weakest link is usually the thing that gets you, and it's the thing that people are just overlooking. Or the other thing that hackers use that's interesting here is they just they make people feel rushed and fearful. So, you know, this might also help define some of the cultures of politics that we have now. But anyway, I'm monologuing too much. Let's go to Kiyoshi and then Alex.
Oh, sorry. Just before that, I just wanted to add two things. There is something to Amazon has a new policy where if you have like one of those Echoes, they're going to automatically give you, you're going to be a part of a mesh network unless you sign to not be on it. And the idea is they want to make better service for their paying customers, not free service for those in need. That's one. And then two, I watched a really nice documentary about black holes and the unknowable knowledge on Netflix. And I'm sorry if Netflix is too mainstream, but it actually seemed to be really interesting on the idea of what we can't penetrate. So black holes is the only thing that we know in existence that cannot be penetrated by mathematics or even quantum computing. It's actually resistant, as we know right now. But anyway, thank you.
Yeah, I just wanted to piggyback off of what Andrew was just saying is that, like, I mean, in the decade and a half since this was written, like, cybersecurity obviously has come a long ways. I mean, it's always chasing after the red teams in a sense, but at this point, the weakest link in most networks is the people who are using it. It's like no level of great cybersecurity will help if somebody with high access to whatever network falls for like some sort of phishing attempt. Is like, oh, now they have all of the passwords to change anything they want to. And one other thought that did occur to me with this is that, like, I feel like, I mean, maybe people will disagree with me here, but I feel like Donald Trump was actually an excellent example of somebody finding an exploit in the US political network and just like running with it without, I mean, in almost true hacker form, without like initially having much of an intent other than just the lulls. Which is horrible, but also kind of darkly funny to me.
I think the right wing caught up to like having a hacker mindset really quickly. They were behind for a very long time. And the left hasn't really figured it out right now, at least in the United States. They're still really, they're with like Hillary needing to secure her emails still, you know, and Joe Biden telling you that he's going to fight some really good cyber war, and they're not doing the lulls. They're not figuring out the memes. I mean, maybe there's this sort of like Marxist left sort of doing it. Maybe BLM and Me Too is sort of meant to be the sort of viral approach to or something. But yeah, it's something that we're sort of missing right now. And I think that there's this sort of very mediocre Angela Nagel book kind of about it. She argues that transgression and subversion has always been a right-wing ideal. I think she's actually wrong. I think that it's probably equal opportunity or even kind of a leftist ideal, but that the thing that needs to come up, like the thing that the left is really missing right now, at least in most of the contexts I operate in, is like people thinking in this much more opportunistic, hackery, what are the vulnerabilities, how to exploit them kind of way. Got a lot of hands. Do we know what order?
Can I share some thoughts first, because I cannot raise my hand. And I didn't want to take place from somebody else. I had two thoughts reading this, and just after the discussion, I just want to share them. Just to say a few things of how I understand the networks today. I believe that we are in a constant reconstruction of our relation to information and to sharing and to ourselves all the time. And this relationship is very complex, and it contributes to a coevolution of all network components of us, Homo sapiens technological. And it's interesting to also see how we change ourselves because of the means that we use inside these networks, and how we are defined as human beings by the possibilities that we conceive for ourselves. Inside, to my opinion, a false distinction between the human subject that who invents and the technical object that is invented. To me, all human tools, from the first stone to artificial intelligence, are human, are the mirror of the self and what it produces for the continuation of life. And maybe, I don't know, Derrida would say that the invention of writing is the point where humans deliver their human nature into a tool that distinguishes them from other beings and allows them to name themselves and to narrate their stories. I think it is Derrida, I'm sure. So the technical shapes and invents, and in the same way that it is shaped and invented, belonging to a larger history of the technical object, to my opinion, in which the technical and the human are linked and evolve mutually. And so what I'm trying to say is that technology and humans is the same thing. And I was really impressed by one of the tactics proposed in the counter-protocological practices in order to inflict a political change. It was not the act of resistance, And in the impulsion, the thrust, not to beat the enemy, but to become better enemies and to push forward and to the excess of this human machine technology networking. And I found this very interesting. And to push technology forward in a hypertrophic state, not try to destroy, but to push further. And I found it like a very interesting tactic because it reminded me of the text We Are All Very Anxious, where the writers were talking about us fighting previous arrangements that might not exist in the West today, like the misery of the working class or the métro, boulot, dodo, just work and no life of the 70s, instead of anxiety, which is the actual problem. So I thought how sometimes we might be fighting in a completely different directions. And not that I avoid machines or technology, but I have been engaged in creating, for example, more local technologies like offline networks, for example, and I have been working with Pirate Box in Athens Biennial and Berlin Biennial. And now, I don't know, after this text, now it seems like to become better enemies is a much more interesting alternative. I have no answer, just a thought that I had. Oh, and the second thought, what was very interesting was this division between the bioterrorist threats, like the anthrax letters, and the naturally emerging infectious diseases, such as SARS and COVID that we all know now, and how this division exists. And the first case is the use of biology as a weapon, a criminal act, and the second one has no subject. And then I immediately had the thought that it would be interesting to also see how, for example, in the COVID case, Trump, for example, that was mentioned before, was the first to put a subject on COVID, like the subject of China, the Chinese disease, the lab in China. Even today it is discussed, and then it had many other faces as well, many other subjects, like the poor that are infected because they're homeless or because they have bad living conditions, or the working class that might be infected because they cannot work from home, the refugees that are in camps without a doctor, immigrants that it's always their fault. And in Greece, for example, it was the religious that meet in the church despite the curfew, or the young that they dare to loiter in parks to drink beer after the curfew, or the leftists or the feminists that they dare to demonstrate against a law that is passing. And that was another thought that I had.
Do you want to go, Harris?
I think it's you, Charlie. I think you raised it before me.
So I can never really tell. I wanted to so to come back to what Andrew was saying before. I think it's a really interesting point today. The idea that sort of this exploitation has only really happened on the right. My immediate impression, which I sort of thought about and I think is actually broadly correct, is that the people who on the right are actually doing stuff, on the left are cynical. And I don't say that as an especially negative thing, but I say it as, rather than being kind of having any kind of direction, having any kind of consistency, we might say, the people that it's hard to quantify this because it's basically just what I see on Twitter, but it's very much sort of just a tapping out of the system, saying the system doesn't work. And I think this is in the US, I'm thinking, goes back, or at least you can kind of epitomize it with the way that the existing protocol, I suppose you'd say, in the Democratic Party, shut out Bernie Sanders. He was winning some of the primaries, and then all the centrists just said, we're going to drop out, we're going to support Biden. Basically unified under Obama. It's roughly what happened as I understand it. And so this was the kind of Bernie was, roughly speaking, the form that this rejection of the system took, but it was still very much kind of a very watered down rejection. And then when that happened, it was just, okay, the system's just there, we're just gonna sit, we're just gonna sort of let it happen. Meanwhile, on the right wing, it was growing stronger and stronger and stronger. And so what we have now is a state where on the right you've got Trump, you've got QAnon, and there's nothing like a left-wing QAnon. And I don't think QAnon is not a good thing, but I think the fact that there is nothing like this is, I suppose, curious. And so I'm wondering, can we diagnose or where this cynicism happens and what the actual differences are? And if we're being really pessimistic, can we say that it's because on the left we have this rejection of identity, and possibly it's actually this identity that the right feeds on that is necessary to develop this exploitation, in which we might say, well, is the left screwed? Open question though. Don't want to make that conclusion now. But that's my sort of intuitions about that. Thank you.
Yeah, if I can jump in, and it sort of connects to what Charlie was saying. I think it's even more connected to Charlie's first comment on COVID. Of course, as all of you are reading this, and especially with examples with SARS, I was really thinking about the present situation. And one of the things I've been thinking about is that as radical politics or progressive politics might come to be oriented around the exploit, in ways that we have discussed and that they propose, then maybe power, and especially state power, might become oriented around epidemiology. Again, in ways that they sort of hint at. And there's been a lot of discussion about the state after COVID, state power and authority after COVID, given increased powers to the state with the lockdown, all these kind of things. But I was wondering if more so than the powers themselves, what is emerging is a new kind of organization of the powers, a new kind of logic, a strategy, an epidemiological strategy, which is oriented precisely around the exploit. The constant search for probabilistic risks in an attempt to offset this, to prevent them. As a new function of domination. Of course, I think we're going to see a lot more of the state, and especially in contrast to liberal powers, to free markets, etc., after COVID and in the years to come. And I was wondering precisely this: if as we become oriented around exploits, then states might be becoming oriented toward epidemiology and around preventing exploits. So yeah, that was my idea.
Well, I think that this question has been dealt with in a variety of ways previously, and it was a little bit more, let's say, simplistic. I mean, not as a criticism, but just that it hasn't continued to mature as much, or that it had earlier stages. So Ulrich Beck's The Risk Society was quite popular when it came out, because they were imagining what happens when nation states are no longer as focused on yes, no, we are sovereign, we control everything, top-down management, and it's more about probabilistic approaches, which is everything about the incursion of quantitative, statistical, calculative modes of reason, which, if we're actually looking at it, goes at least back to the 17th century. I mean, even the name statistics itself is derived from state thinking and the types of calculations and numbers collected by states in order to manage in this very different balance of powers sort of way. So I think one of the questions we'd have to have is like, what is this new approach? How might it really fundamentally change things? Because initially, I think with the pandemic, a lot of states simply responded with a mixture of scientific epidemiological reason, but then a lot of just sovereign control, shutting down borders, reasserting the importance of various nationalities, et cetera, which played into the sort of renewed nationalism that is going on right now, and a sort of different version than neoconservatism, which is very much about being in an interest of capital. And of course, the right wing is always sort of debating between these. Do we need to open things back up? Do we want to close them down? Where is transport happening? Who do we prioritize in the process? All that kind of stuff. I think one of the interesting questions might be like, what are the cutting edge technologies and how are they being used right now. So like with money and the money supply, cryptocurrency is funny because it has all these Austrian economics principles built into it, which are really sort of reactionary and right-wing and old, like they're sort of pre-Keynesian. So the thing that I'm actually really worried about, and is maybe the thing to predict for that, will be what happens once JP Morgan and all these other big banks start figuring out, crypto from true post-Keynesian principles, and they start deploying them in their ways. Then it's going to get really dangerous really quick. And it's going to mutate into something even more pernicious than what we have right now. So I think one of the questions would be like, what are the exploits that are being used by the right wing? I think Kiyoshi was very right. Trump was a sort of exploit. Like, how are they going to continue developing exploits? And what do we do about this? Like, what are they doing? I jokingly said in the chat that, the GFP has become a clickbait party. Certainly, the left or other groups aren't free of this either, but it's like, it's probably only going to get more clickbait. And so it makes sense that a failed multi-level marketing like hawker, who one of his campaign events in 2016 was him selling Trump steaks and Trump water and Trump vodka on TV, became president. It happened in Italy, a decade earlier with another media magnate, right? So this is only going to be more popular. Kanye running for president just seemed to make sense. Are we going to have Oprah for president before too long? Maybe not. But I think all of those cyberpunk fantasies that we had about dystopia in the 1980s, like, many of them will probably come true, and they probably weren't weird enough. So, like someone had said in the chat, we need to keep reading Cory Doctorow and whatever, and not treating it as some sort of like fantasy future. Like, this is it. And I think we have a choice of how much we want to participate in this. And we could always stand back and morally judge these things and say, oh, we're too good for this, or we're going to hold some sort of virtuous line. But personally, I'm very interested in trying to see what are the exploits for our side, for our team, and why aren't we using them more? Let's move on to the Browne. I want to make sure we get some time to talk about the Browne. Did anyone have any initial reflections on the Browne? I teach her work in classes and in schools, and what's interesting is she comes up a lot in community groups, especially abolitionist groups. There's a move right now to not only work in abolitionism, at least in the US and globally, against prisons and mass incarceration, but also the surveillance culture that comes with it, and some of the proposed solutions to mass surveillance or to mass incarceration, which is decarceration, but can involve many digital components. Brian Jordan Jefferson in Digitize and Punish, from Digitize and Punish, is actually thinking about how are the ways in which, once you actually end mass prisons, can you simply have other supervisory and monitoring techniques? Usually in the US, it goes under systems of parole, where you give people ankle bracelets where they have to check in with parole officers and things like that. What are the ways in which digital technologies will only increase the amount of doing that? And one statistic Jefferson notes is that the most connected, digitized, smart places in many major cities are the poor and racialized areas of town, because they have all kinds of cameras, surveillance systems, monitoring, oversight. They listen in for various forms of cell phone communication, some of it legally mandated, some of it more generic. They're constantly having wired and connected police cars and helicopters driving through. They're collecting human intelligence by interviewing people, putting them in databases and whatever. So if you want to see the most technologically saturated area of a city, it's probably the area of the city that is most policed, rather than, let's say, where all the tech workers work and live. So anyway, anyone have any first remarks or reflections on the Browne piece? If people are listening in, the portion of the Browne that we read was a section where she does a material history of surveillance technology, to say surveillance is not something that's new, that comes with, let's say, remote cameras. But she first looks at the slave ship as a form of surveillance and surveillance architecture, but then she talks about plantations, passes given to slaves, how runaways were addressed and dealt with. And then she looks at even the census as a form of accounting technology that informs all the ways in which surveillance has existed, and no doubt informs the way in which we'll continue to develop as well. Other thoughts, reflections?
So this is just a very thing, just to sort of get things started. I'm struck, and this is, I suppose, not specific to the Browne piece, but it's something she talked about, or race what she talked about, of how surveillance and population control and all the stuff that Foucault talks about as well is kind of inherently paradoxical, because especially in the case of the one drop rule and the lady in the piece who looked white and looked like a man, or at least past a man, was defined as being black through the act of surveilling. And so the way that the object is produced through the act of surveillance, I just found very, I suppose it's nothing new, but it was very clearly illustrated by this sort of application of surveillance to the racial politics of slavery. Really not much more to say than that, just sort of thinking about that. Thank you.
Yeah, and the reference, which we didn't read, I think it's in the introduction, she references it to Stuart Hall, who's this major figure in 20th century thought. He was not one of the founding members, but he was perhaps the second generation and even exceeded the original Birmingham School of Cultural Studies. He brought together really helpful thinkings on not only class, but then race and power and a number of other super essential ideas. Like, for instance, that race is a floating signifier. So it's not actually encoding of any one particular thing, but it fulfills its role most importantly through the fact that it can be projected onto various things. He theorizes also a term he gets from Frantz Fanon called epidermalization, in which he is interested in the idea on how race can be thought to be read off the body. But in fact, that, you talk to any biologist about it, they'll be like, well, yeah, actually, how we determine populations is really fluid, it's hard to tell, and it's really not something that you phenotypically just read on someone in that precise way. And so this launches into this whole question that I think is super essential for surveillance, which is, why do we see race as something tied to vision? So the aesthetics of appearance and light and sight. And is there something racialized about all forms of sight and seeing? So are there even any forms of seeing that aren't racialized? And what are the ways that those get encoded in technologies? Not just because of bad data sets, which is what sort of, let's say, a liberal mainstream tech developer would say. They're like, oh no, we accidentally only trained all of our seeing algorithms on white people's faces. So we had bad data in, and so we're getting bad data out. If we got a more accurate form of data, then it would be better. That's what the sort of liberal approach would say. In fact, this is actually the liberal approach to education, through affirmative action, for instance. So University of Michigan is racist because it doesn't have the same demographic composition of the state of Michigan. And in fact, if we just sort of shift the demographic representation to be the same, or if we had the same amount of faculty who make up the state of Michigan, then University of Michigan would cease being a racist institution, right? And so, in fact, the other claim that we're looking at here that Browne is really great on, that I think is really amazing to consider, is it's not about bad data, and that if you equalize the data, you're going to get the right result. It's about the process. It's about the device that's in the middle of the process, and that it's the device, not its inputs or its outputs. And the device, of course, is sight and all the devices created to see.
Yeah, and it goes the same for, besides race, for gender, the male gaze. And again, what the example that Charlie gave, it just shows the performativity of these categories. And I was amazed by this, the description for the wanted kind of sign. It said that she was a woman that looks completely like a white woman, but is not legally free and therefore, together. And this was really, for example, the one drop rule as a kind of social construction of race, but also in terms again of tactics and maneuvers, it really reminded me of the points from Dark Deleuze about sort of the conspiracy or deception, but becoming rather than becoming clandestine. And again, I find this really inspiring because if these people could pose as non-slaves through again it's through performative techniques. For example, they would say that they could read and write, and then they would forge passes, or they would present themselves as being as traveling for another purpose. And I find really inspiring about contemporary strategy and what can we do to subvert sight, but sight through different mediums. So as you mentioned, the contemporary version would be CCTV cameras or digital technologies around us. Yeah, just these thoughts.
Sorry, I'm trying to talk. Yeah, sorry, this is, I got a bit lost. I think this is related to what you just said. Something that this performativity really sort of set off is how it's not just at the time kind of like legal performativity, like we say that this person is black, therefore they're black, but that actually it's had the effect, whether intentional or not, that I think largely in the whatever imaginary we have, however far we can talk about that, in the visual imaginary though at least, and you see this through cinema and whatever, that we think of slave owners as white, and that's probably broadly fair enough, but we think of slaves as visually, phenotypically, entirely black, again, whatever that might mean. Whereas, as we see, in this, that I think the reason it's so striking is that at least as a white person, I saw this and thought this doesn't fit with my visual imaginary, because the idea of thinking of someone who looks basically like me as being a slave just doesn't click. So it's not even just that you have this creation of them as black, it's that you actually have a kind of a subsumption of material reality under this kind of faux empiricism of sight. It actually does create a visualization that is, it's not just empirically dodgy because empiricism is never neutral, is that it actually recreates an actual visual data set that is just not material and not historically grounded, which I thought was a fascinating thought that I just had.
I think the strategy and tactics question that Harris brings up are quite important here too, which is what's the intended purpose or goal? If it's one to shore up the law in order to say that there are people who have been unjustly categorized as criminals or people of deserving surveillance, and there are people who do deserve being surveilled, then all of the solutions that are proposed are going to be very different than if someone is taking, let's say, an exploit-based approach, where they're trying to undermine the system of surveillance more broadly. And so I think that within Black study and Black studies, there's a variety of strategies that are proposed. Fugitivity is an interesting one because I think it has alignment with a traditional approach to Deleuze and Deleuze studies, in that it's saying capacity under captivity. And it's older model is especially going to the Afro-Caribbean, but also other places and plantations in which people could escape. But then the model here is the fugitive wouldn't permanently escape and leave and, start just some commune by themselves elsewhere, though, that sometimes happens. And in like the Eastern United States, there's a famous one that was a multiracial community in which it was often poor whites or formerly indentured servants who also work with runaways in maroon communities. But the sort of conflictual based approach is if someone is able to run away, then what are the ways in which they're able to get others free? So the much lauded stories of the Underground Railroad or slave uprisings and revolts like in Haiti. And how might this relate to contemporary politics? Is it that one needs criminal justice reform? Is it that we need a series of regulations for against surveillance cameras? Like in San Francisco and Portland, they're currently trying to ban various forms of facial recognition software. Or what are the ways in which this is operationalized? There were recently some attempts by activists to create some open source software to use facial recognition against police officers who were themselves masking their identity somehow, like their badge numbers or just like not knowing who they are in the moment you see them engaging in some sort of activity. This reminds me of the much older tactic it's called cop watch, in which people who are maybe not from a neighborhood or just people in general bring a camera around them and they camera what police officers are doing. And they find very quickly that police will act differently when they know that they're being watched, they're being surveilled. Sometimes isn't initially met well by people in the neighborhood though, because they also feel like they're being watched. So there's a whole series of sort of tactics and approaches. Browne talks about the cop watch-like thing as surveillance or surveillance, which is an artistic sort of term that was initially invented. So there's a lot of takes here, and I'm a bit suspicious of the sort of like, well, let's just surveil the police and put them in our criminal database and that sort of thing too, because once again, I think it believes in the transparency and effectiveness of collecting information and data, which is usually only effective and useful in contexts like those that Charlie are talking about, which is in a court, in front of a judge, as evidence in order to bring the force of the law to bear on a situation again, which is not a situation that is very effective against police practices, as we all know.
I also like the text a lot. All this bureaucracy and state archives as the device, as you were saying, Andrew, of racial politics. And I'm also thinking of more recent examples. I remember a work by the artist, I think, Daniel Garcia Andújar. It was in Documental 14. It was, I think the name was The Disasters of War. And it was presenting, among other things, a big photographical archive of race characteristics that was held by the German Nazi regime in order to classify races. And I'm also thinking of big data and surveillance cameras and the Chinese surveillance and face recognition system, being able to see if you have paid taxes or if you have paid your bank, pushing it even further than the racial thing. And I wonder how you run away from that.
Yeah, and I think one of the challenges with that too is that artists or liberals often think that people just don't know that there's this bad thing going on. And so it's simply their job to show versions of it to others. And then when they see it, suddenly it will lose its power. But I don't think showing, let's say, police gunning down a black man diminishes the power of the police. And in some ways, there's this paradoxical problem where it reinforces the power of police because it shows just simply how malicious they are and reinserts it into the spectacular economy where the only response is maybe some sort of knee-jerk empathy that white liberals are meant to respond with. That can be very easily dissolved, and it dissipates usually far before any forms of structural change occur. We have two hands, Brendan and Gustavo.
Yeah, I wanted to jump off the last thing you said, Andrew, about how like continuous or like adding cops to the surveillance regime is just trusting the idea that data and transparency is going to end up helping And it really only works in juridical context, and it also kind of relies on this idea that the people who are getting that information know how to parse it in a way that's useful. Going back to what Donna was saying about sort of changing our relationship to information and the way that disinformation has sort of run rampant, I think the first reading today kind of gave me this way of thinking about disinformation that was helpful, and also kind of helps me understand Deleuze and Guattari's ideas, just in the sense that it's sort of it takes one network, which is the information system, and then sort of augments its valence by feeding off of, say, like people's economic systems that they live in. So if you look at, say, people who live in the Midwest or Pennsylvania here, who like, they know that they're supposed to take in information. They know they're supposed to like have judgment about it, but it also plays off the sort of cultural need to be the one who's making the decisions. And as a result, it ends up bringing people into sort of this like spreading disinformation or creating like a personality, or like a, you know, the person that they are online, that sort of ends up creating this very divided like group to deal with, or something like that. So that was just kind of to wrap up everything that I've been thinking about, and this idea of the flood from the first reading today.
Gustavo?
Sorry about that. I wanted to say, well, thank you again. And I guess there's so much to unpack, but one of the things what jumped out at me was from the first article, a building from what you said, Andrew, is, you know, some of the poorest communities are the most policed. And I'm always quite shocked that I guess that some of the richest are not policed, or there's laws that shelter them. So it would be really good logic to say, oh, the richest should have the best surveillance. Maybe we should know every last ounce of them. Like, you know, why not? So I'm just thinking, as kind of a tool, we should say, sure, I have nothing to hide, so you shouldn't have all of your monies in all these offshore accounts to hide either. So that would be one thing that I guess struck me. But then I thought about the idea of race and being categorized. So I've never really quite understood why we aren't identified as people. I don't understand the idea of cattle, people as cattle, but I guess, you know, is this a function of capitalism, or is this a function that has been a part of human society through history? Like, there are others. There's not our tribe or family, but there's others. But this is a kind of a new understanding of others. And then I'm thinking about our data footprints. So we're categorized anyway in these computational systems as others if we have, you know, a debt to, you know, capital ratio. So what does that mean in this categorization here? Because at some level, we have these identifying markers. They're the physical markers. And those, I think, are residues of the societal inequities, let's say. But what about those digital footprints? I guess this would be a question for anyone, but for, I guess, Andrew, are there other names that we're not aware of that are data names? So instead of, I guess I'm seen as a Hispanic, but I've always hated that term. For me, it's, you know, I would be either Latino or just a human being. So I think those are my initial thoughts, is if we're going to this multiverse and avatars can be anything and we can represent ourselves as anything, how are we going to be recognized in these new systems as either DNA or data or both, or even a virus? I don't know. Anyway, thank you.
Yeah, I think you asked a really sort of big searching question that you certainly won't be able to answer just in a couple of minutes, initially about the issue of race, and then the other one about data. But let me give a tentative response to both of them. The first is, I don't think there's any one understanding or approach to race. There's a number of different analytics that I think do things good and bad. So actually, one of the earliest paradigms on race that I was taught, which I think is probably one of the most popular ones still taught in the United States, is the historical sociology of race by some Marxists, broadly, sociologists, Omi and Winant. And their sort of approach is a historical racialization approach in which they think that race is materially sedimented into both institutions and the micro practices of individuals, and they map it in this rather complex sort of way. And they say that it exists in different national contexts in different ways. So like if you were to go to Brazil, the ways in which people get categorized, those very same people, if you were to take them to the United States or Greece, it would be very different. And so they're interested in sociological description as sociologists, and ultimately as an attempt to sort of change as well. But sociologists tend to be in the sort of descriptive mode. There's also a just sort of capitalist question of where race as well as anti-Blackness comes from. And you're right that some of it is capitalist, in that the sort of modern moment of race is a combination of questions of nation and national culture, a issue of labor and labor practices tied to the triangle slave trade, the national culture about both solidification of Europe, but also colonization of Europe of the world by Europe. But then third, about science, the ways in which science contributed and made forms of knowledge in which they invested in various categories of race. And some of them still exist that certain scientists or doctors still find useful for, let's say, public health interventions. So saying that, Black Americans are more susceptible to sickle cell anemia or something. And this creates a series of problems because different people are invested in this in different sorts of ways. Now, none of those promote a way to resolving race, of course. And so then you have to look at what various responses are. So, let's say a socialist Marxist often wants to say that race simply divides us. And so we need to get rid of those divisions so people can come together on a more common basis, such as material self-interest or even interest as a class, as a laboring class. And so then race is seen as a dividing tactic simply introduced by capitalists or other people in power. I think that I find that a bit insufficient, and I think it doesn't do enough service to the ways in which race continues to operate. Plus, it tells people that largely they have to put it aside. They have to sort of ignore it. There's obviously supremacist notions of race or prioritization versions of race that sometimes feed their ways into new or different forms of nationalism, which also can be a bit unsavory and doesn't ultimately look in the big picture either. And so we have to ask this other sort of issue of so what are other theories of race that we have? A quite popular one right now is the one coming through Afro-pessimism that associates it with social death, which has existed in various sort of slave societies, but it's a particularly dramatic one at certain moments, in which it's tied in part to othering, but a very specific form of othering. They give it through characteristics. Disgrace, like symbolic and public disgrace, natal alienation, which is to say breaking up someone's ability to have family and a relationship to both their own children, but also larger family structures. And then, what's the third one? Generalized disgrace or dishonor. Maybe just death, like marking someone for death and the ability to do gratuitous violence on them, not just if you want to, but also the purpose is to mark their separation through their ability to be the object of extreme violence. And so they say that this is sort of the status that various particular people have, and they actually distinguish that as anti-Blackness from race. And they'll say that race and theories of racism are different than Blackness and anti-Blackness. And I think this is a debate that we're going to continue sort of seeing even more of, that there's something specific about anti-Blackness than there is about race and racism. And there might even be post-racial forms of anti-Blackness. And that we need to be very careful to, in some ways be intersectional in the sense of looking at the ways in which it might combine with gender or sexuality or something like that, but know that these are very different modes and there are different social theories for how they happen. So not to assume that there's any analogy between the ways in which we theorize something like anti-Blackness or sex or gender, because their history, how they operate, and the processes behind them are very different. Politically, one thing that I find common cause in some aspects of Afro-pessimism that I find interesting is that their strategy that they come up with is to say that the Blackness is the 0 point of the human subject, which is to say the farthest you can take the human subject. For them, they would say it's a point where they're not even considered human or a subject at all. And the strategy is not to try and incorporate various people who've been put in that strategy back into humans, say, oh, they've been temporarily kept away and we need to sort of bring them back. They say that that is then the 0 point for all political struggle as well. That political struggle or some sort of approach through needs to move through that position, which interestingly has a sort of resonance in D&G where they say becoming Black. And I don't think they mean sort of imitating Blackness, which of course is cheap appropriation and really kind of scary and offensive, but instead to imagine what is the structural position of Blackness, and imagine that all political struggle has to go through that structural position. The old maxim for this is nobody's free until we're all free, and you can put people in that sort of figuration too, but nobody's free until Black women are free or trans Black women are free. But I think it sort of all gets at this sort of notion that as long as there's this category of otherness and exclusion, that it's going to be a limit, that's going to be a severe critique and challenge to most political transformation. As for the question of data, I think this is the other sort of piece of the pie here, which is that starting in the 60s or so, people started moving away from an ontology of race, which is say race is, and then give some sort of transhistorical or at least very deep definition for it. And they started just making it a statistical entity. Race is people who self-identify as X, but then they have all these characteristics that are associated simply due to whatever the numbers say right now. And so that completely empties of any social significance and meaning, both to relate to how people relate to themselves, but also as a lever for, let's say, social transformation or change. And so that sort of datification is, I think, our current reality for most people, which is probably a reason why race seems like such an obscure and untenable category to think about, because it doesn't necessarily mean anything to a lot of the people who talk about it and use it and relate to it. It just means like a grab bag of statistics. And they're not statistics of anyone's choosing, like about epidemiology. It's about a population and it's put on by experts. And so, how you're categorized by the ad algorithms, both on platforms like Facebook, but then how they're sold to data brokers and the data body or data profile that's created about you by either these sort of gray market private corporations or public entities like the state are usually not your own choosing. And it's usually through a string of mathematical statistics and models that people are constantly tweaking and shifting and changing. And they're not meant to be coherent. They're just meant to be sort of useful. So it gets back to all of these other issues and problems that I think Galloway and Thacker were thinking about. What happens in a world in which your subjectivity is tied up to a data self rather than your genuine self? And the liberal response would be like, I want my data self to match my true self. One of the strategies or tactics they propose here is non-existence, to say, what if you can eliminate your data self? Your true self still exists, but what if you can minimize your data self or even get rid of it? Another one would be, how do I multiply my data sets? How can I have many, many different data sets? This is a security tactic a lot of people propose. Say have not just one email address, maybe have 5, 10 email addresses, have a million profiles, segment, change, multiply, shift. And there are even ways that this gets automated and shifted. There are apps and things to help move and share and transform things to sort of corrupt and mutate as things go. So anyway, I've given quite a bit now. I think it's probably time we should start wrapping up. But hopefully that starts to answer both these issues of race, anti-Blackness, and the new data self. There's a project that came out of Michigan by some abolitionists called My Data Bodies. I can find the link as people are sharing, but that might be something to follow up on too, to see the ways in which people have thought about this from a broadly, let's call it, social justice perspective. Any parting remarks from others?
I just wanted to chime in, I guess, final thoughts is, I was thinking about, Andrew, I guess Andrew and Dana or anyone here, what is our government asking us to do facing climate change? Like I've been pondering that because they're really not solving problems that I can see. They're kind of easing us into some worst case scenario. And I would ask you, I guess to me, it's similar to the idea of the alien. We're looking at these alien sightings and I'm going, why is this even relevant now? We have starving children and we have people that are in need. So even imagining a solution that goes beyond race, is that even useful? Like I'm not disillusioned. I go back to first principles and thinking we're fighting over just facts and the educational system. Like, why can't we just have a truth? Is it because power wants to control our societal fantasy that we're all powerful here? And this is very United States specific. Like, what is the ultimate goal? And I guess maybe I'm thinking about this in a limited manner, but are we just poking at the sky? Or what can we do? Like, I don't know, maybe now I'm depressed, but I'm still hopeful.
I think climate change in general might be a little bit beyond the scope of anything we can answer quickly, but I think it's a good provocation on how to address it given the tools and weapons we thought of today. And maybe I would return it by having a provocation of my own, which would say, what are the exploits that have still not been found yet in terms of how to deal with the climate struggle? And how might they be useful as an alternative for people like you and us to the market-based regulatory and public policy approaches that we know that millions are probably already working on that might be useful, but don't have the sort of other framework that we've considered today. So let's just wrap it from here. And Dan and I were talking over, yeah, totally. Dan and I were talking about over email. What if we made the next session in a couple weeks about our writing projects? Yeah, would that be interesting? Love to get people's feedback. One thing that I was just sort of pondering was, we sent a few emails back and forth, but it also seemed like at this point it was very like open-ended and there's so many different directions it could go and sort of hard to sort of get our arms around. So maybe one approach might be, what if we initially thought of it within just the terms that have been each one of our sessions, as well as some of the concepts that have come from it? I mean, we could expand beyond that too, but using that as our initial sort of container to try and help sort of guide people's thoughts and some of the writing we do. Yeah?
Yeah.
Cool. So maybe we'll do a little write-up about that and then just invite people to meet up probably 2 weeks again and talk about the writing, maybe even bring some ideas of writing that people like. And I don't know what a decision-making process would be, but we'll figure something out.
Good.
Cool. Thanks, everybody. It's always a pleasure, and look forward to seeing you all again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining Quiver. For more, visit our website at ourquiver.org, where you can RSVP for future events and see readings. We also ask you to subscribe while you're there to our newsletter. Till later, Quiver.